urinated all over himself, his pants, and the conference room chair. I swear under the penalty of perjury, the above is true and accurate. Signed, W. Warren H. Binford, June 26, 2019.
So we are going to welcome Warren Binford. It was every time I see it, it's very emotional, and I see Warren is very emotional as well right now, recalling it. But I just really wanted to share that piece. This is where she's testifying about the conditions that she saw in the detention center and sharing some of the children's stories. So Warren is going to share her screen right now, and we will learn from her.
Thank you so much, Darlene. So I am just gonna pull up a slide deck that I prepared for you all to give you a quick tour of what we've been saying. I want you to know first and foremost that I did not come up with this title. I never would have come up with this title, because when you ask why kids are in cages, there is no answer. There is no reason for any child to ever be in a cage. And so by asking this question, it suggests that there's an explanation for this inhumane behavior, and there is none. But what I can do is to try and give you a sense of how we got here. So let's first ask ourselves whether this is all fake news. Are kids really in cages? And the sad truth is that yes, kids are being kept in cages. They are being kept in cages in Border Patrol facilities and also processing facilities that are run by the U.S. government. This is true, and I know that it's true because for the last few years, I've been asked, based upon my expertise, to visit facilities run by the U.S. government where children are being kept, and to report on the conditions, to interview the children, if they're with their families, to interview their families, find out who they are, why they're there, whether or not their rights have been respected while they are in the care of the U.S. government. And as you saw from that video, based upon a sworn declaration that I submitted in federal court, their rights are frequently being violated. So you need to know that kids are being kept in cages, but kids aren't just being kept in cages. That one of the things that we've been witnessing the last 4 years now, is that an increasing number of children continue to arrive at the United States with their families, but then they were routinely being separated. And so we have interviewed children who arrived with a mother, for example, and then at a Border Patrol facility, the mother refused to leave her children, and the guards literally would tell her that they were going to give her children a shower and take her children to the showers. And as you know, with what we know about the Holocaust and the people to go to places where they were going to be killed, this is a horrific way for U.S. government employees to lie to a mother and her child, and in order to separate them. And then after they've been separated, we've heard stories about the children being taken to one place in the same facility while the mother is taken away for usually a court appearance or something else. And then when she comes back, the child is never returned to her. We hear from the child that they are kept there until after dark, and then all alone. And then after dark, they describe being taken in vans with dark windows to places like airport tarmacs, where they are put in buses with darkened windows and then driven hours and hours and hours, often overnight, in reconstructing where they went, across state lines to places like Texas, where the US government has hired people to care for these children in substandard, inhumane facilities. Now, the children describe being taken in, a place like Texas to a giant bus stop, or bus station actually, and then the children on the buses, who have all been separated from their parents or who arrived to the United States unaccompanied, are then put into more smaller vans with darkened windows, and then they are driven across the state, with one child being dropped off in one location, another child being dropped off in another location, until finally they arrive at the final destination, which in this case was a giant Walmart that had been taken over by someone who refers to himself as Father Juan. Father Juan has converted this Walmart into a giant facility where over 15 children were being kept, and we interviewed the children there. And these children, we witnessed being forced to walk in single file lines of groups of 8 or more, past giant murals, including a mural of President Trump, which says at the bottom of it, "In order to win the war, sometimes you have to lose a few battles." And I'm looking at that mural, and these kids who are forced to march single file lines in front of this mural 6 times a day, and ask, what is the message that America is trying to children through that mural and making them live in this way? Some of the children were kept in this Walmart, hardly ever able to leave, for over 9. Some of these children, somebody put in the chat a question about the limited languages. We have a lot of children who are from indigenous communities, and the children from the indigenous communities described only one other child from that indigenous community who speaks the same language as being with them, and then for no apparent reason, separate and placed on other ends of the facility, so that they literally had no one else to talk to in their own language for weeks or months on end, being subjected to religions that are not their own, and languages, being isolated in language and culture. At the same time that children were being taken to places like the giant Walmart, Casa Padre, I and somebody from Human Rights Watch that I do a lot of this work with went over to the Port Isabel Detention Center and interviewed the parents of some of these children to ask them about their experiences. I will tell you, I love children. I love children as much as anybody else on the planet. And the children were so traumatized by what they had experienced, but the parents that we interviewed were beside themselves. They were so emotionally and psychologically tortured, because many of them brought their children to the United States to be with family and loved ones here, maybe the other parent, maybe it was, grandparents, aunts, and uncles who could keep them safe. Many of them were trying to escape gang violence, rapes, etc. Many of them were trying to escape a sexually abusive family member, because they're coming from countries in which family sex abuse is tolerated. Many forms of sex abuse are tolerated. Patriarchy, abuse of patriarchy is tolerated. And in bringing their children to the United States to keep them safe, they have lost track of them, and they have no idea where their children are, with whom their children are, what is being done to their children. And it was incredibly upsetting as a mother to interview both mothers and fathers and asking them, what had happened to them and their children, and what the US government had done to them. In addition to going to places like Border Patrol stations and the Walmart, we also visited this location where basically the United States government gave a contract to a Baptist organization, Baptist Children and Family Services, which is based out of Texas. And what they told the president of this nonprofit organization, which normally historically has provided when you have natural disasters, they provide natural disasters relief to communities. They have all of these tents and all of these easy to erect, structures that can protect people when a natural disaster has struck. Well, the Trump administration went to this organization, this nonprofit organization, and said, we are having a crisis at the border and we need your help. We need to keep these children safe in your tents because we can't leave them in Border Patrol stations. Well, the president of the nonprofit knew what Border Patrol stations look like, and he was willing to accept this contract to house children because he felt like he could create a community, a temporary community that was safer for the children than what they would have and healthier for the children than what they would have had in Border Patrol stations. But later he learned that he and his colleague hired in order to keep children here in these tents to absorb the children who were being separated from their families. And he realized that he was being used by President Trump's administration. And when it came time for the contract to end, he refused to renew it. And they offered him a significant amount of money, hundreds of millions of dollars. And he said, there is no price that you can pay to get me to morally perpetuate, support, advance your agenda in separating children from their parents. And in fact, the decision to end the child separation policy ended the next day after he made clear that he would not renew the contract once and for all because virtually they had no place to send the children. Some of the children that we interviewed here at the Tornado Tent City had in fact been there for over 9 months. Even though this was supposed to be, the tent city was supposed to be the last place the children went before being reunified with their families or being placed in the United States. We also went to this facility, which is the Clint Border Patrol facility. So this is one of the Border Patrol facilities that we went to, but this one was especially outrageous because this facility, which is actually quite beautiful for a Border Patrol station, it is a new Border Patrol station. It is an environmentally responsible Border Patrol station in that they use solar power and other things. That in fact, what we found when we went there was 350 children who were being kept in this warehouse and a loading dock and overcrowded jail cells. And when we went there, we had no children. We had no idea whether children would be there at all because the government won't tell us where the children are. We have to do inspections around the country and determine for ourselves where the children are. And the government would not tell us that they were keeping children here, but we found out from some of the people who are on the front lines outside of El Paso, Texas, that there were reports being circulated that a lot of children are being kept there. And we actually found out that shortly before our arrival, there were approximately 700 children being kept in this facility that had originally been licensed for 104. When we arrived, they handed us a roster of children of over 350 children, and we couldn't believe our eyes because they had nowhere to put the children, and they wouldn't tell us where they were putting the children, and they wouldn't allow us to inspect the facility. And we started to bring the children in to interview them, and it sounded like they were describing a warehouse, many of them. We couldn't figure it out. It was only later that we were able to drive around the facility, and we saw what appeared to be this recently erected warehouse with no windows, and it had these porta potties, these I believe it was eight or nine porta potties over on the side. And we're like, oh my God, I think that they are keeping these kids in a windowless warehouse. And sure enough, we went back the next day and we asked one of the children to draw a picture of where they're being kept. And sure enough, you see right there on the right-hand side that you have 9 porta potties that the child has drawn. You also, if you look at the photographs that I had taken the day before, after we left the facility, you see that there was a showers trailer there that they had just recently brought in when they found out we were coming, and a little emergency doctor station there because so many of the children were sick. And that's when we knew that they really were keeping the kids in this warehouse. That's the emergency trailer described. And then also, that the children had described. Now, many of the children had not been given a shower yet. Many of the children said that they were sent to the shower trailer just before we arrived. And after not having any change of clothes for weeks on end, that they were given new clothes finally, but many of the children had not been given new clothes. Many of the children had not been given a shower. So it was clear to us that it appeared that there was a cover-up going on, and that when they found out that we were going to come to the Clint Border Patrol facility, that they immediately started to try and get rid of as many of the kids as they could, give the ones who were left showers, clean clothes if they had it. We also had the kids, some of the kids were describing sleeping on tents outside. And we found, you know, this facility to the right of the showers where the kids are in tents inside this razor wire. So a really horrific situation. But not all the kids are in cages. Sometimes they are in jail cells. Sometimes they are in, you know, in tents in the desert. Sometimes they are in windowless warehouses, and other times they're in loading docks. So a really horrific situation. So it's not fake news, it's true. And I've been to these facilities and I've interviewed these children. So how did this happen? You can't understand how this happened until you look at the history of the United States relationship with Central America and Mexico. And what you find is that basically the United States had one company in particular go into this region and basically engage in extractive economic, you know, conduct, where they exploited the Central Americans. This is where the word, you know, banana republic, the phrase banana republic comes from. And basically what happened was they built railroads, and they took over land and took over a lot of the government services and everything. And they paid the people who worked for the company next to nothing. And they took away all of the assets that these countries had. I use the example of Guatemala because, as you'll see in a few minutes, a lot of the children that I've interviewed come from Guatemala. And what you find is that, not surprisingly, after the United Fruit Company, which is now called Chiquita Banana, so you've probably heard of Chiquita Banana, after the United Fruit Company exploited the Guatemalan people for about close to half a century, the people pushed back and they established a democratic government. And this democratic government tried to pass labor reforms so that workers were paid fair amounts of money, and that they, you know, the citizens of Guatemala could own the land in Guatemala, and you couldn't have outside corporations coming in and taking the land against the citizens. And the United Fruit Company had connections all through the United States government, particularly in the White House. And what ended up happening is that literally, this is the truth, you can find it, you know, in the historical documents in the possession of the United States government. The United States government launched a covert operation carried out by the CIA that facilitated the overthrow of the democratically elected government. And basically, you know, the Guatemalan people were left without strong leadership after that, because the U.S. government continued to try and control who was leading Guatemala, and they were never able to develop a really strong and vibrant independent economy because of the U.S. government's interference. Well, because Guatemala and other countries in the region didn't have, you know, the natural formation of democratic leadership, it created a power vacuum. And what ended up happening is that the US developed a dependence on drugs. And we created a huge market for drugs in the United States. And so we started to buy drugs from South America that traveled through Central America and Mexico into the United States, where they could be sold. And this gave rise to control of these regions, not by governments, but by criminals. And children are routinely forced to join these gangs under threat of death. And girl children are often forced into sex slavery from these gangs. Many of the stories we hear about why families leave involve, you know, the threat of rape or the actual rape. Sometimes there are executions, beheadings, limbs cut off, etc., of a sister, you know, who refused to be the sex slave of the gang leader, and then the rest of the family leaves because they don't want that to happen to any of their other daughters. And so you basically have the United States government being involved in illicit activity, creating a power vacuum, and then that power vacuum being filled by gang leaders in order to feed our appetite for drugs and also guns. There's a lot of gun trafficking that's also happening in this region. So in that context, you can see that the United States has had an amount of irregular immigration. By irregular, I mean, people who come to the United States undocumented. Remember, that is all entirely legal if they're here to claim asylum. It is not legal if they come here for economic opportunities or other opportunities that are not lawfully allowed. If they arrive illegal, that is the equivalent, that's a misdemeanor. That's the equivalent of playing your music too loud. So I want you to keep that in mind. So we had a lot of immigration, relatively speaking, in the 80s and 90s. But then that level of irregular immigration significantly dropped in recent years. And so one of the things that we heard in the 2016 presidential campaign is that we have this crisis and that we have all this illegal immigration and that we've got to get it under control. And in fact, when you look at the numbers, you're talking about 300,000 people relative to 1.6 million, 20 years ago. And so we're nowhere near the numbers that we've seen historically that we've been able to manage. What's different, what we are seeing in recent years is an increase in the number of kids who are arriving at our southern border. And so, for example, in 2014, when this crisis first started to make headlines, you saw almost 70,000 kids who were arriving to the United States. The majority of the kids who arrived in the United States have family or other loved ones who are here in the United States, and that's what's bringing them north. So we watched those numbers drop down after 2014. And as you can see, 2015, which was the year before the 2016 crisis, where the presidential campaign was so focused on this, that it was down by a third what it was in the year past, but that didn't change the rhetoric of that campaign. This is a graph that shows you where these kids are coming from. And what you see is that over the last 7 years, there are fewer kids coming from Mexico and more kids coming from Guatemala. And that's where I brought in the history of Guatemala, is because we're seeing more and more kids coming from that region, but we also see children coming from El Salvador and Honduras as well, for the same reasons that we see children coming from Guatemala, and other countries in the region were also affected by the US's interference in their democratically elected governments. So what we are also seeing, in addition to an increase in the number of unaccompanied children coming to the United States, we're seeing more families coming to the United States. So as you can see, if you're talking about 300,000 people coming to the United States in 2016 and 2017, you're talking about approximately a quarter of those being in family units. And so we did not see this historically. So what you're seeing when you talk about family units, a lot of these family units are young mothers. So they might be teen mothers or mothers in their 20s and children coming. A lot of them are trying to escape from these conditions that I've described. This is a chart that shows you how the breakdown looks in recent years since 2012. So the blue lines are the individual children. I actually can't see the key at the bottom, so I'm sorry if I'm not saying that right. Oh, there we are. So I didn't mean to do that. I was just trying to see my key. But in any event, you have the blue and the green. The blue is single adults and the green is unaccompanied children or family unit members. And what you see is that in 2019, most of the people arriving in the United States were in fact unaccompanied children or family unit members. And what's fascinating to me about this is, remember when we were talking about how there was about 300,000 people who were coming in 2015, a year before all that rhetoric, which was one of the lowest years in modern history since the 60s, and early 70s. Well, what's fascinating to me about this is that I actually read a study last year that shows that when you introduce draconian immigration policies, it can actually lead to an increase in irregular migration because people are trying to rush across the border because they think that this is their last chance. So the effect of all of these inhumane immigration policies that were intentionally directed towards children and families may have actually led to this big increase in irregular migration in 2019, not the decrease that it was supposed to cause. So when I say, that this is intentional, I'm relying on a lot of documents, more and more of which have become public recently. This one is a document that appeared to be a memo of Stephen Miller, who is the president's immigration policy advisor. And everything that I and others have witnessed the last 4 years, and now you've witnessed it too, through reading the news and learning about it through the things that you've read and the people that you've spoken to, it was all planned. And it was intended to cause people to stop coming to the United States by making it so painful, by treating the children so poorly, by taking them away from their parents and everything. So this was not incidental. So how did we push back? So a couple of things. One is Mizell versus ICE. So Mizell versus ICE was the lawsuit that was brought on behalf of the parents whose children were taken away from them when they arrived to the United States. The parents, represented by Mizell, it's a class action suit, basically said that they had a constitutional right to family integrity. As you know, in the United States, we are a constitutional republic, but the protections of the Constitution are not limited to citizens. Some of the constitutional protections are limited to citizens, such as the right to vote, but other protections are not limited to citizens. And the judge in Mizell versus ICE found that there is a constitutional right to family integrity, and that this constitutional right extends to both citizens and non-citizens alike, and ordered the U.S. government to reunify the children who had been separated from their families to be reunited with their parents. You probably saw the news today that there remains over 500 children that we know about who have not been reunified with their families. And that's because, frankly, the government wasn't keeping track. Some of the people on the front lines tried to keep track, and they knew that there was no family ID number that was assigned in our immigration system. And they were really worried when they were made to separate children from their parents. But when the Washington, D.C. Politicians found out that the frontline officials had created family ID numbers, they told them to destroy those records. And I predict that some of those children will never be reunited with their families. That lawsuit is continuing today because, as I said, some of them have never been reunited, and the families are still separated. In addition to that lawsuit, another lawsuit that we have relied on very heavily and that we've been involved in and tried to support is Flores v. Barr. Flores v. Barr is actually a lawsuit that was brought in 1985 on behalf of children who are being cared for by the U.S. government. When I say cared for, that's not actually the right word, because they were being abused by the U.S. government. They were being subjected to strip searches. Some of the girls were being subject to vaginal searches. They were being kept with unrelated adult men. And basically, the government litigated this case for 12 years. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court and all the way back down again. And sometimes the court sided with the children, and some of the time the court sided with the government, until finally the government got together and they said, with the children's attorneys, and they said, okay, let's just agree that, the children will be kept in safe and sanitary conditions that address the unique vulnerability of minors, that they will be kept for the shortest period of time possible, and that children will have access to toilets and sinks, drinking waters, food, medical assistance, that they'll have adequate temperature control, adequate adult supervision, and the children will be able to maintain contact with any family members that they were apprehended with. In addition to that, it said that children are supposed to be released without delay, and this was later determined to be no more than approximately 20 days, which the government had basically said is how long they needed at longest. And what we witnessed last year is that some of the children were being kept on average 89 days. So when the children are released, they're supposed to be released according to their parents in the United States, or another adult relative living in the United States, or another adult living in the United States who has been authorized by the parents, not the government. Or if there's no parent in the United States, no other adult relative in the United States, or no other adult authorized by the parents to take custody of the child, then a licensed program. But even then, it's supposed to be in the least restrictive setting possible in a, and like it says, in a licensed facility. It's not supposed to be in a Walmart. It's not supposed to be in a tent or anything like that. They're trying to keep this as normal as possible. And keep in mind that only 11% of the children need to go into a licensed program. All of the other children have family here, loved ones who want to take care of them. So what ended up happening is that the Flores Agreement was only supposed to be temporary. And the Trump administration was the first administration, unfortunately, to actually introduce, to try and implement regulations to replace Flores. The problem was that the regulations that the Trump administration introduced didn't look anything like the Flores regulations. The Flores Agreement, the Trump regulations said that they could keep the children indefinitely, that they could keep them in unlicensed facilities, that they could decide what standards of care to apply apply to where the children were being kept, and that the minute that the children turned 18, that all of the protections that they had as children were lost and couldn't be returned to them, which meant that basically they could keep them locked up until they were 18 and then just send them back, regardless of what threats faced them in the country that they had fled from. The Flores judge said that doesn't bear any resemblance to what you've agreed to. And so the Trump administration appealed the court's decision. The Flores Agreement still stands, and now that case is pending before the Ninth Circuit. There are lots of other cases that are being brought as well, but those are the two main cases. So what else are we doing? Well, in addition to trying to litigate, with the cases that I just mentioned and other tort claims that were brought by parents, the state attorney generals have brought a lawsuit, and lots of other lawsuits have been brought. We started a campaign called Amplify the Children. It's called Project Amplify, and you can visit it at amplifythechildren.org. And basically what we tried to do is, after we left the Border Patrol facility, we went public about what we found in that facility, and it ended up creating a national and international furor. A president said that it was fake news, that none of this was true, and the vice president flew down to one of the facilities in Texas, and basically they cleaned the kids up, put them in fresh sweatsuits like we've seen in another facility, a family residential facility in Dilley, Texas, and said, look, they fed the kids. They said, look what a great job that we're doing. You can't trust, Warren Binford and Michael Bohanek and others. They're not telling you the truth. And so they put on that whole facade. And the question was, I'm only, one white middle-aged woman, I can't be the voice for these children. But we literally had hundreds and hundreds of declarations that we had collected from the children over the years that were publicly available on the court site, but they were behind a paywall. And so what we did was we created this website, the Amplify the Children website, and we put the children's public declarations redacted on that website. And we asked people to read those declarations and to find ways to amplify the children. We also went to Congress. Some of our members testified in Congress. We also did congressional briefings and tried to propose legislation to protect the children going forward. We went to the international community, filed with the Human Rights Council, and we have been going down to Mexico since the Remain in Mexico policy was introduced, and we have tried to document what's happening to the children and families that have been sent to Mexico by the United States government. So here you have a picture of a temporary restraining order that was filed the week that we left the Clinton Border Patrol facility. And in fact, that very emotional declaration that you read in that recording at the beginning of this, that was submitted in support of this motion, which says basically you have to stop mistreating the children that way. This is an example of the filing that we did at the UN Human Rights Council. But what I want to do now is show you some of the really powerful work that other people have done. We have had musicians from all around the country read the children stories, their testimonies, and written music about it. This person did an entire album from different declarations from the kids. Chris Ranger of True North Duo, she and her husband, their band, have been chosen. Their song, The Ghost of Abuelito, has been chosen as a semifinalist for Song of the Year at the Grammys. And I am so excited to share with you all that I have a surprise. Kristen and Dan, the semifinalists for Song of the Year at the Grammys, are here right now to perform The Ghost of Abuelito live. So Kristen and Dan, thank you so much for coming. And would you be willing to share the song that you wrote inspired by the children at the border with us?
You just couldn't stop me. I'm gonna do it regardless.
Excellent, thank you so much.
Ready. Miguel, my brother, he's 11. I'm Alma, I am 7. Old enough to remember home. Sound of gunfire in the night, an ordinary part of life, at least the only life I've ever known. Miguel refused to cry the day headed north from Ecuador, the USA. Even when we gave our dog away, even after throwing stones to make her stay. He says the ghost of Abuelito comes to him when he's afraid. His spirit comes down from the stars, still smells of coffee and cigars. But when he is there, Miguel is brave. Abuelito wanted it that way. Across the border, things got tense, with our backs against the fence. All those uniforms and guns. Americanos took our mother in one direction and us the other, and we haven't seen our mother since. Inside, hungry babies crying, and I can't stop myself from always asking why. When will my mama come to get me? Did she go off and forget me? And Miguel just takes my hand and sighs. He says the ghost of Abuelito comes to us when we're afraid. His spirit comes down from the stars, still smells of coffee and cigars. But when he is there, we'll both be brave. Abuelito wanted it that way. He says Abuelito told him, America will always take you in. Her gates are guarded by a goddess. She welcomes you no matter where you've been. Minutes to hours, days to weeks, Miguel, my brother, hardly speaks. Bit by bit, he's disappearing. I asked him if he'd say the prayer, the one that brings Abuelito here. He says Abuelito's hard of hearing. Inside, 100 babies cry. The ones that are old enough to talk keep asking why. When will my mama come to get me? Does she go off and forget me? And I take their tiny hands and lie. I say the ghosts of los abuelos guard us as we sleep under the moon. How abuelos hate to see us suffer. They're out searching for our mothers, and they'll bring our mothers soon. How abuelos hate to see us suffer. They're out searching for our mothers, and they'll bring our mothers soon.
Thank you, thank you, thank you so much, Kristen and Dan, for writing it and for performing it. So Kristen and Dan are, they have a website. I'm trying to just go, they have a recording of this that's available on YouTube if you'd like to hear that again. They also, their album also is a semi-finalist for album of the year in the folk Americana category. They've got a live show this Saturday night, so feel free to visit, the Ghost of Abuelito on YouTube. We have a Amplify the Children song list, so you can hear all these different songs, 40-something songs written by musical artists all around the country that are all inspired or based upon the children's declarations, and they're incredibly powerful. So I encourage you to check those out. In addition to the musical artists from around the country writing songs that are incredibly powerful based on these children's stories, there was a group of New York-based artists who organized an art exhibit that well-known artists from around the world created works of art inspired by the children. And you can see that the collection tries to reflect different aspects of the children's experiences in the U.S. detention facilities. And they off these works of art at a flat rate and ended up raising $160,000 for these kids. There were about 132 different works of art. And one of my favorite parts is that the works were exhibited at the Whitman Walker 1 mile from the White House. In addition to the artists and the musicians coming together from around the country, reading the children's declarations, which are really, really hard to read, but are available on the Amplify the Children website, cartoonists from around the country created an entire book, a compilation of comics that gave accounts of what the children's experiences were, what other experiences have been as they immigrate to the United States. In addition to that, you saw a recording of me reading one of my declarations. There actually is a whole selection of declarations that were written by the children or by some of the experts who were visiting the facilities and observed how the children looked and how they were being treated, being read by people like this one's David Schwimmer from Friends. And you can go to the Flores Exhibits website and watch those videos. They're incredibly powerful, emotionally exhausting. In addition to that, the Chicago musical theater community put together a benefit concert where they wrote songs. Different composers wrote songs about the kids, and then the songs were performed by members of the musical theater community and a fundraiser for the children at the border. There also is a book that is coming out on April 13th. It's called, it actually was called The Story No Child Should Tell. We've changed it to Hear My Voice. And this book is written entirely from excerpts from the children's declarations. And then we had 17 Latinx illustrators, children's book illustrators, who donated works of art inspired by the children's accounts to, to illustrate the book. And that the book has been picked up by Workman Publishing. And so you can order it on Amazon now, and then it'll be delivered to you in April. It is written in Spanish in one direction and English in the other direction. And so it is a bilingual book. You also have the works of independent artists. Hysterical Men did a lot of street art in Philadelphia. Other people have also done street art around the country. Just Amanda, who's on Twitter, you see this day 339 after she heard an interview I gave about the conditions in which the kids were being kept and how they were being treated. She promised to create a work of art every single day until the children, there are no children left in detention in the United States. And, like I say, here she's on day 339. She's still painting to this day. We are down from about 14,000 kids at one point last year to a few hundred children today. However, that's a few hundred children too many. And so Amanda is continuing to paint almost every single day. And you can see what she has created if you go to her Twitter site. In addition to that, I did an interview Pod Save America, and happening. I didn't know that it was a big deal. I did it while I was in Japan at like 2 o'clock in the morning. And I said, we need people all over the country to be using their talents to tell these children's stories in all these different ways. And here South Park did their first episode about last year in season 23 about what was happening to these children on the border. and you know, and how awful they were being treated by the U.S. government. In addition to that, children organized a butterfly exhibit in the U.S. Capitol where they had people create butterflies, 14,000 butterflies, actually 15,000 butterflies, to represent all the children who were in detention at the time. And so people, including my church, you know, sent these children the butterflies that we made, and then they traveled back to DC and exhibited them in Congress with the help of President Merkley. In addition to that, Raza has had a very controversial campaign going on, which is the No Kids in Cages campaign. And people have been renting billboards denouncing these practices, including at places outside the facilities where the kids are being kept. Skywriters got together and they did a whole skywriting campaign across the United States in high profile locations that say things like no more camps. And we've tried to get the messages out and to amplify the children's voices and the voices of everyday Americans who are putting lawn signs up and having postcard parties and things like that in order to keep Congress focused on these issues, because Congress has made clear that the only way that we're going to be able to pass legislation to avoid the exploitation and abuse of these children, I should say the neglect and abuse of these children, is if we keep the pressure on Congress. But first, we have to make sure that we have a Congress that is receptive to values of treating children well. So what have we learned in this process? The first thing that we've learned is that there are all different kinds of people, and many of these people are good. And it's important for us to believe in the goodness of one another, the goodness of people and the goodness of one another. In addition to that, we need to recognize that whereas we all have an inherent goodness, we have differences, but we shouldn't focus so much on the differences that we need to identify what our common values are and build on those. So that, for example, this gentleman, he is a person who designs software that shares information in natural disasters and tries to reunite families and get them the emergency information that they need. And someone who knew someone connected me with him when we were trying to identify software to reunify families. We were trying to operate this project called Project Reunify when the children were being separated. He is LDS. He is a father of 9 children, I think it was, stay-at-home mom, lifelong Republican, and he was totally and fully committed to ending child separation and ending the detention of children in these really abusive conditions. So it doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat or independent or a libertarian or whatever, do you believe that it's wrong for children to be abused? Do you believe in family integrity? And if you do, we can work together. So it's important to identify what our common values are and to build our relationships on those. Another lesson is the importance of innovating. So this is Peter Shea, a picture of Peter Shea. And, we were at Peter's house really late one night down in Southern California. And Peter is 70-something years old. And here he is trying to design his own website. Now, Peter is not a techie. He's never been a techie. He has no technological knowledge or talent. But he knew that he needed to create a platform that could help to reunify these children and their families. And so he was trying to do it himself. Fortunately, we were able to bring in some techies to help him to do that. He now has a new website. But the fact is that he was in a frame of mind, just like we all need to be in really challenging times like this, where he's like, we need to do things differently. And he was doing them. And it's the responsibility of each of us to figure out how to approach things differently. But it's not enough to innovate, and it's not enough to believe in the goodness of people, and it's not enough to look for common values. We also have to work together. And that's something that we've seen again and again, whether, every facility that I've gone to, I always have at least one or more people pull me aside and say, we need you to be successful. These kids don't belong here. You've got to end this. Like, these kids can't handle this. You've got to get them out. So you've got to work together and realize that you have allies everywhere. We have allies inside the government. We have allies outside the government, and we have to use those relationships to try and protect these children. And it's not just adults, you know, that children can help too. And, you know, and families can help, and, you know, older people can help as well. It's going to take all of us. And then another lesson that we have to keep in mind is that we need to take a stand, even if nobody else is taking a stand at that point in time. Even if you have to do it alone, you have to take a stand. This man was standing outside that tent city in Tornillo, Texas for months and months and months. I took this picture of him when we were interviewing the kids at Tornillo. There later was a documentary that was made about him. He stood out in the desert every single day. Every child who came into that facility saw him standing there with a sign that said, free them. Every worker who arrived there every day saw him with a sign that said, free them. And it's important for us to serve as public moral compasses to one another. And then, you know, the last lesson is to trust Mr. Rogers. He used to say that when bad things are happening, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helpers. And it's important for us to look for the helpers, and it's also important for us to be helpers. So what can you do? I changed the slide yesterday, and the reason is, at this point in history, you need to vote. You need to absolutely vote, and you need to vote for the people who will end the abuse of children, who will end the neglect of children, who will end the separation of children from their families. They are suffering childhood trauma that will have lifelong consequences for them unless you vote to get abusive people out and to get responsible leaders in. But it's not enough to vote. You need to get out the vote. So not only cast your vote, but you need to make sure that other people are getting to the polls and voting for people who can end this insanity, because it is an insanity. You can visit our website at projectamplify.org. This is a nonprofit organization. We have done everything as volunteers except for one, you know, project manager that we spent a few $1,000s on to try and launch one final campaign this month to try and get people to send postcards. We have The Guardian has donated free ad space to us to try and get people to contact Congress, to cast their votes, to end this madness. And some other Twitter's also donated ad space. Verizon's donated ad space. And so we hired somebody to launch this last campaign, but everything else that has been done is entirely volunteer. And you can visit Project Amplify and read the children's accounts and learn what you can do to help. So with that, we'll open it up to questions.
So I'm gonna ask you a couple of, first of all, thank you, Warren. Thank you so much. We're just so honored that you came, because you have so much great knowledge and firsthand experience. We're really excited when you said yes to coming. So of course, every time this gets mentioned, let's get the elephant out of the room, okay? Obama. It's Obama's fault, okay? So what is the difference between Obama's administration and Trump's administration on the whole issue of the children?
Yeah. So I'm gonna be honest with you, I hated Obama. I was so upset with Obama because he was keeping kids in facilities for 32 days on average. That is outrageous. Kids do not need to be in facilities for 32 days. And I thought he was evil for letting that happen. I miss Obama so much. Like, I would love for these kids to only be kept in facilities for 32 days. You know, what the difference is between Obama and President Trump is that Obama didn't separate children from their families. The only 3 times that children were separated under Obama was if the parent was not really the parent, that they were a child trafficker. 2, there was evidence of abuse or neglect, and not just any neglect, severe neglect, that there was the child was not safe in the parent's care. Or 3, the parent was a known and wanted felon. So when you say, well, Obama separated children from their parents, he separated them from their parents only when it was in the children's best interest. He didn't do it as a policy in order to try and prevent irregular migration. He did it to protect the children, not to hurt them. This administration, government document after government document after government account of people who have left the government are consistent in saying that we hurt children for political reasons. That is unconscionable. We took children from their parents in order to try and score votes or score points with our supporters. That is immoral. So what's different about Obama and President Trump is that Obama separated a few children to protect them, whereas President Trump separated children in order to hurt them. Now, what President Obama did was he built facilities that for the children that would keep the families together, that would keep the children with their parents. And those facilities, I've visited them, have a library, a cafeteria, a school, a basketball court, playgrounds. Should the children be there even for 32 days? No, because children should not be in cages. They shouldn't be in warehouses. They shouldn't be in facilities that are surrounded by fences. We know that this hurts children. They need to be integrated into the communities. It doesn't mean that every child who arrives in the United States needs to be allowed to stay here permanently, but they are entitled to due process. And they are, you know, when they ask for asylum, they are entitled to due process in that asylum process, and they are entitled to be kept with their family, and they are entitled to be not abused and neglected during the processing of their asylum application. So you have no routine separation of children for political purposes happening with Obama. You also had far fewer children being locked up and for far shorter period of time under Obama. And the facilities that he was trying to develop for these kids to stay in while they were being developed, they were wrong in that they were, you know, basically locked into a facility, but the facilities were being designed with the intent of keeping the families together and having appropriate activities for the kids. So like, I would do anything to have Obama and his policies back and then battle those policies than what we have now, where literally President Trump was requesting, he was lying to the court while I was at one of these facilities. He was lying about how many kids were there, how many empty beds were there and stuff. I mean, they were literally lying to the court because I was looking at the empty beds and I had the roster in my hand and asking the court to let the government send the kids to abandoned military bases and keep them indefinitely. It's a whole different game with Trump. The number of kids, how long they're being kept, the separation, it's awful.
Thank you so much. have another question for you, but I'm going to ask Teresa Castellano because all the time we hear people say it's their own fault. So how do you respond to that? They're the ones bringing the kids over the tent. It's their own fault.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I would add that between the Obama and Trump thing, I think every president has done something to harm the immigrant population, starting from Clinton to Bush to Obama to Trump currently. And it's been all about taking away rights, taking away due process, taking away access. And the reason we have 11 million undocumented people in this country is because we created laws to create that population. So we're creating the situation that is currently existing. When we know that we have a population that feeds us, that clothes us, we discovered the word essential workers, and a lot of the undocumented community is essential workers in this pandemic. So just to backtrack a little bit. And then the question of, I would say that anyone that is migrating to save their lives. They're not migrating out of convenience. They are migrating because they are running away to have a life. And they are bringing their children because they want their children to have a life. People don't walk across thousands of miles of desert and through 2 to 3 countries just because they want a little bit more convenient life. They are walking those miles because their lives are being threatened and they see no other future for their life other than fleeing. And so that's my answer to that question.
Yeah.
So, go ahead, Warren.
And I'll just share, you know, there was one little boy who described his experience of why he left his home country. And he described that the gangs were trying to force him and his best friend into the gangs day after day, but he wanted to go to school. He wanted to get a good education. He wanted to be a good person. And one day after school, the gangs did what they had done recently, which is they were following them again and trying to say, if you don't join us, we're going to kill you. And then literally they decapitated his friend right in front of him, 14 years old. He ran all the way to the U.S. border. He did not stop. There were times when he got on buses or trains and he relied on the goodness of people, but he literally headed north because he had family in the United States and he had just seen his friend being decapitated. It's like, this is why people are coming to the United States, is because we have created a situation in Central America and in Mexico where we have prevented them from developing healthy, functioning governments so that we could, our companies could exploit them, that we could exploit the land, they could exploit the people. And then what we did was we tried to set up labor pools during World War II because our men had gone off to fight the war, and we arranged for Mexicans to come to the United States. And instead of investing in their own country and building roads there, and we had them come to the United States and work our farms and build our roads. And then when it was no longer convenient because our soldiers came back from World War II, we deported all of those men. Many of them, they owned land in the United States and cars, and they had money, they had paychecks owed them and everything. And so there is this whole history of a dependence on labor from other countries and exploitation of their workers, both in those countries and here for American benefit. But when it's not convenient to us, as Teresa was saying, we either make them invisible in the United States or we make them invisible by deporting them. So we take what we want from them, but then we don't give them the benefits of their labor and
I would add
as criminals.
And I would add that when there were civil wars in Central America about redefining their economic future, as Americans, we allied ourselves with specific sides. Those communities fled as refugees of war to the United States, came to LA that had gang issues that we armed in LA as government, and that all came out as our US history. These kids learned how to be gang members, and then we deported them all through Central America, all through Mexico, and all through the Southwest. It has spread. So this gang problem that has been created was created in the United States.
That's correct.
And then now we have those communities fleeing because they're being forced into gangs, because they're being killed, because the girls are being raped, because of all these things that we have created in this relationship with Central America.
Yep, that's exactly right. Our hands are all over this. This is not their fault. This is something where we literally made them dependent on us and then, have rejected them or continued to exploit them by making them part of the shadow society where, they're not able to enforce their rights. So
and
that we
El
can further exploit them. El
Salvador is the death capital of the world, and Honduras is the death capital of the world for women. And that's why they are fleeing.
Yeah.
So Sean mentioned, because I was going to ask about sterilization next, that we heard about the sterilizations going on, which is not a new thing for the United States, as some of us know. Unfortunately, not all of us know because we don't learn these things in history. But what is going on with that, Warren? I'll let you start.
So I can't say because I'm not involved with that case. I haven't visited that facility. I haven't interviewed those women. What I can tell you is that during my visits to the immigration facilities where children and families were being kept, we saw a marked, a marked decrease in the quality and the amount of medical attention that the children and families were being given, so that we had children who were limp in their mother's arms and had like rashes up their backs, and they could not get medical care and a fever, and they could not get medical care for their child. And then I went to the head of that facility and said, this child clearly needs medical attention. And they said, no, we've already looked at him, he's fine. There's nothing that we can do. And literally, I found out that at the same time, the first death of 7 occurred at that same facility at that same time. And all the mothers and children that we were interviewing were describing a widespread fever, illness, respiratory condition that was affecting them. The same thing happened at the Clint Border Patrol facility. There were lice infestations. There was, you know, a fever and respiratory condition there. We had children who had a similar condition in another facility the week before on the other side of Texas, and nobody was caring for them. We had babies who were newborns who were limp in their mother's arms. The mothers weren't being given enough water in order to produce breast milk to nurse their babies. So the babies were dehydrated, the mothers were dehydrated. And, you know, it was literally inhumane what we've witnessed as far as the care is concerned. And that's why actually the whole trip to the Clint Border Patrol facility, it was organized by a woman named Hope Fry, who organized a lot of these. And she was so upset because no kids had died in government custody in about a decade, almost a decade. And then we had 7 deaths in the period of approximately 1 year in the facilities or shortly after the kids were released. And we were watching the deterioration in the condition of the kids and all the neglect that was happening and getting worse and worse and worse. And she said, you know, we've got to go to these facilities and find out what's going on. And sure enough, in all the facilities that we went to during those visits, we were seeing widespread illness on the part of the kids and no one taking care of it. Like Anne Frank didn't die in the gas chamber. She died from a disease that is passed through lice. And that's what we were seeing in the Clint Border Patrol facility, was that the kids were getting lice from each other because the guards gave them 2 combs and told them to share the combs. And so the kids, you know, 50-something kids in one jail cell were all having to share the same comb, and then they were getting a lice infection because of it. And then when one of the combs was lost, the guards told them, we're going to take away your beds, and all you girls are going to sleep in, these are like toddlers and preschoolers and grade school children, in addition to teenagers, all of you are going to sleep on the cold floors because you lost the lice comb. And I came the next day for another visit that was unscheduled to see if the guards really made them sleep on the cold floors that night. And when we pulled the girls out of the room for their interviews, every single one of them confirmed that they in fact had been made to sleep on the floor that night.
So I'm going to ask you a double question. One is, the federal judge ruled the Trump administration needed to release the migrant children. I'm guessing this is when a lot of the children were released recently. And if you could tell me the number, because a lot of people are asking about the number. And then the follow-up to that question was about shadow immigration, how there's children that they're putting in the hotels with no supervision or care. So go ahead.
Yeah, I see Teresa has her hand up. So Teresa, you're muted. Okay, so Lauren has profound knowledge. She will add to everything about. What I want to make clear is that this is not the first time immigration does this. This is not the first time the U.S. government does this. We have a history of separating children from Indigenous people. We have a history of separating Black children from slaves. We have a history of using this as a tactic and as a deterrent of control. And so, yes, it existed under the Obama administration, but it became systematic under this current administration. The other thing that I will add is that over 400 executive orders have been signed by this current president, and they started within the week of his presidency. So this is a strategy and a tactic to deter immigration to the United States, to spread fear. When this first started in May of 2018, I remember I went to that rally. It was the first time that and I'm active in the immigrant rights movement. It was the first time that it was not a rally that I had been part of organizing. It ended up being a completely white rally of white people in solidarity with and outrage for what was taking place. And I remember walking around there and just crying because of the impotence that I felt, because my DNA remembered what this meant and to what degree this was going to go to. And so I finally found the Indigenous dancers who ended up being the only Latinos there. And I just started crying, and crying not only for myself, but for the generations of Indigenous people that this has happened to. And one thing that I want to point out, that the majority of people that are facing this, and the majority of children, if you look at the children, at the pictures, are Indigenous children. They don't even speak Spanish. Mm-hmm. And so these children are being separated in a structure that they don't understand, that they don't know, in a language that they don't understand and they don't know. And this government purposely gave the parents one number and the children another number so that they could never be reunified again. This was developed as a tactic to terrify people across the continent to not migrate on their own homelands. And so I just wanted to make sure that I pointed that out. And I would also add that in those 400 executive orders, covers amnesty, covers children, covers incarceration, covers so many things. And we're not even talking about workers' rights. We're not talking about women's rights. We're not talking about housing issues that he's issued executive orders. We're talking about only immigration. And so obviously I'll let Professor Warren speak. But that is the kind of campaign and strategic that has been. I have worked in this field for 30 years. I have heard many of these ideas before. And before it was like, oh, they're crazy, they would never do that. Everything that we have possibly heard in the last 20, 30 years about how to control immigration has not only been experimented with, but it's been put into place.
So it's hard for me to follow that up, Teresa. You know, your passion and your knowledge is very humbling. You don't need me to affirm that truth. And so it's, you know, on the one hand, I want to say, yes, yes, yes. But then I feel like, you know, I'm giving you affirmation that you don't need, and that, you know, our viewers don't need for me to give. But I absolutely agree with you. I do want to say that I think that we are better than this, and that these children and their families are better than this, and that our past does not have to define us as a nation, and that it is critical that we recognize the wrongs that we've committed historically, and that the wrongs that we are actively committing now as a nation, we have the power to end it. And that's why it's so important that people go into the poll booth knowing what is at stake here, whether we are going to be a country that intentionally separates children from their parents and causes them lifelong trauma for political reasons, or if we are going to assert our inherent goodness and vote to end these barbaric practices.
And I would add not just lifelong trauma, we're talking about intergenerational trauma that
Yes.
will take generations to heal. This is not going to be one generation. This is going to be many generations. And then I would also add, we're talking about a government who's been told by judges, you need to do this, he ignores it. Who's been told by judges this is in place, he says, I'm not going to do it. Even with DACA, the Supreme Court told him you have to reinitiate this program. He said, I'm not going to do it. And so what he keeps showing us is that what we have in place to stop him has not been effective, and he continues to do what he wants to do. Even when the judges and the courts have said, you must do this, you have 30 days to address this issue, he has said no.
So a couple of things. One is that I forgot to say that when you were asking me about the difference between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. And under the Obama administration, when the children's attorneys sued to end certain practices, the Obama administration complied. But what we have here is a president and enablers that will not recognize the authority of the other branches of government. So there's no checks on the system. And so it's not just these children and their families and the effects that that has on the community at risk. It actually is the rule of law that he has, you know, he has rejected the rule of law. He's rejected the court's authority. And that is a threat to the survival of our nation. With regard to the intergenerational trauma, this is actually something that I have been looking at since 2015. And as you know, Teresa, because you were just talking about it, that we now understand from research that's being done involving descendants from the Holocaust and from the indigenous people whose children were sent to boarding schools, that it impacts the expression of our genes, the epigenetics, and that the damage that's done to people with regard to the trauma that damages the their ability to regulate stress and to moderate anxiety, that it basically makes it haywire, and that disruption in the epigenetics is passed down to children and grandchildren. So we know that it's passed down at least 2 generations. And one of the things that I want to research, and I'm working with scientists, neuroscientists and geneticists up in Canada on, that I also want to work with folks at the University of Colorado, is how we can reverse that epigenetic impact of childhood trauma, severe childhood trauma, so that it doesn't get passed down from generation to generation. But we only recently have come to understand that the intergenerational trauma, that it's not sociological, it's not like, oh, your family taught you bad habits because they had a traumatic experience. It, as you said, Teresa, is written into their DNA. And so we've got to figure out how to heal that DNA, but not just how to heal, but how to prevent that trauma in the first place.
So we have 1 minute left, and I had quite a few people ask, how can we help? What can we do?
Yeah.
Vote, vote, vote. No matter what you do, vote. Vote's the most important thing you can do in the next 13 days.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly think that if we don't vote out this administration, that it is the end. It is the end for us. I think that this is our last chance to really make a difference, that there will be so much of you, when you look at the damage and what has been normalized over the last 4 years, if they are reelected, they will do even worse things to our, immigrant community members, our members of the community from other countries, and to the children who arrive at the border, I think. And it's not just enough to vote. We've got to get everybody we know to vote and to end this insanity. And then beyond that, and this is what I'm really excited about, is that if you look at the current 538 numbers, we actually have a chance to retain the House and to get the Senate. We've got a 73 and 100 chance, I think is what the numbers were yesterday. There is an 87 and 100 chance that, that Trump will not be reelected. We would have the White House and both houses of Congress. We actually could get legislation through, and we have supporters. We've already identified them. We've already been going back to Congress. So if you all can contact, the members of Congress after you vote and tell them they need to stop the separation of children from their parents, and they need to stop the abuse of children by the U.S. government, and work with us to establish those standards, that will make a huge difference. And if you go to the Project Amplify website, that amplifythechildren.org website, we have postcards for you to write. We have sample letters. You can organize an online postcard party or letter writing party, but let them know this is a priority, because the congressional leaders have told us they can't move legislation forward unless they hear from their constituents that this is what you want from them.
And I would add that what has been shocking about all of this was, as Indigenous communities, as Latino communities, we thought things were better. We've had an administration that has been very blatant about how things are not better. This pandemic has shown us there's people who are inconvenienced, and there's people who are sacrificing their lives every day to feed us in several different ways, whether it's in the fields, in the grocery stores, or in the restaurants. And this is having a huge impact on the Indigenous community of this continent. And it's about the movement of Indigenous people in their native lands.
Thank you very much. It is 8:02. So unfortunately, we have to end this. And I want to keep going because it's just so interesting, and you guys are very dynamic. But we do need to end it. So thank you so much, Warren, for coming with us tonight. Thank you, Teresa Castellano, for sharing your voice as well. And definitely vote, 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 vote. Everybody vote, get out there and vote. That's the most important thing we can do. And we're just gonna say goodbye because we have to, I see Gabriela is from Latina Coalition. She's waving her hand. Gabriela is waving her hand. Maybe she's not. And then Rosana is from the La Raza Historical Society. And we thank, I don't know that Pratima come on, we thank the Office of Women's Policy for sponsoring these talks. Thank you all so much for coming. And we're going to end the meeting now. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. See you at the polls.